Professor Stiglitz, I read this morning a prediction, which was quite an ambitious prediction, so to speak, that China's economy could bypass the U.S. within the next couple of years. I want to know what you're feeling on that, and what's your estimate as to when China could overtake the U.S.?
Well, the Chinese economy is still markedly smaller than the United States. China has now become the second largest economy in the world, but per capita income in China, depending on how you measure it, and there are big measurement problems, is somewhere a quarter to eighth of the United States. So while they have a lot more people, it doesn't add up to it's still a fraction of the United States. Most of the projections I see the catch-up occurring in a quarter century or so. I don't know what that forecast that you referred to, it may be in terms of the increase in GDP may be larger, because even though the base is smaller, China is growing at 10% of a smaller base, the U.S. is growing at 2%, and so the increase, the absolute increase in GDP in China may actually be comparable to the increase in GDP in the United States, and that will, of course, be especially so if U.S. growth is as weak as it appears to be.
Hot money flowing into Asia, that seems to be the topic that everyone is concerned about. In terms of asset bubbles, I mean, you touched on that in your talk, but is there any specific areas or countries in Asia that you are particularly concerned about?
Well, let me first put this in a global perspective. In the world of globalization, money goes to where it views the returns to be highest. And so, you know, many of the models that are in people's minds, the Federal Reserve mind, is they say if we increase money, the Federal Reserve makes more money available, it will go back to the United States. Not true in a world globalization. They lend money to somebody, to a firm, and they say, where is the best place to invest it? And you ask that, where is the best place to invest it? And you're going to say, where is growth strongest? And the answer there is Asia. Now, the risk that one faces is, are there countries that already are close to having an overheated economy and don't have the tools to dampen that? In my mind, I'm not so worried about China because it has lots of instruments. The economy is obviously doing very strong, 10% growth, but the government has much more control of the banking system, and it's been using lots more instruments at its disposal. So I think that even though the instruments are imperfect, I don't worry so much about China itself. Where I do have a worry are countries like India, where they're debating how much intervention in the market should we have. And there are people who say in India we shouldn't have capital controls, even though Brazil has done it, China has done it, and the more countries around the world have those capital controls, the free capital can only go to fewer and fewer places. And India is one of those. And so in some sense, the strong economies that don't yet have those capital controls become the focal point for all this loose money. And they're the countries that are going to be under a lot of stress. Already, if you look at real estate prices in India, they look out of line. So that's where I would begin to worry.
You seem quite bullish on China, but in terms of its real estate facing a property bubble, what is your feelings on that?
So let me try to give a couple perspectives on that. First, because of China's growth is so strong, what would be a very serious excess capacity for the United States is a much less serious problem for China. So for the United States, if we have 30% overhang, excess capacity, if you're growing at 2% a year, that takes 15 years to work down that overhang. If you're growing at 10%, that's 3 years. So that the relevant sense, the danger of that overhang is markedly different. Secondly, U.S. real estate problems were partly caused by high leverage. In China, there's much less of that leverage. And that means that if prices go down, when prices went down in the United States with that high leverage, many people were underwater. In the case of China, many fewer people are underwater, and therefore the risk of the financial system being impaired is much less than in the United States. So overall, and finally, I can say one of the big differences is that China's economic leaders, I think, are very worried about it and have many instruments at their control and have been working with them. They're, imperfect, but they're working with them. In the United States, when we had this bubble, Alan Greenspan was asked, "Do you have a bubble?" And his answer, "Oh no, just a little froth in the economy." And part of the reason that he came to that view was their economic model said efficient markets cannot have bubbles. There was a syllogism here. Markets are efficient. Efficient markets can't have bubbles, therefore we don't have a bubble. But obviously we did have a bubble. Markets are not always efficient. And so there is not Chinese officials are not wedded to this idea that markets always work perfectly.
Is the world headed for another reserve currency?
Well, I argued, and I chaired a UN commission that argued that in the 21st century, it makes very little sense for the dollar to be the major reserve currency. That to have one country to be the reserve currency of the whole world is really an anachronism. And especially when that reserve currency has all kinds of economic and political problems. And because those economic and political problems are going to lead to a lot of volatility. So we proposed in our report the creation of a new global reserve system. We actually laid out a number of ways in which this could be done, from very small changes moving from an expansion of what is called the SDR, the special drawing rights of the IMF, to the creation of a new system like a Bancor, like Keynes talked about. We described how you could do it, like a bottom-up or top-down approach. The Chiang Mai Initiative in Asia is a regional attempt to create a regional reserve currency. So I think this is absolutely essential. It is. I don't think we're going to get a stable global financial system without this.